Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 30 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past, then continue to shape our view of the world today. In this first historical journey that I want to tell you about, we accompany young Georg Forster on his voyage around the world with Captain Cook in the second half of the 18th century. Georg Forster was born in 1754 near Gdansk and emigrated to London with his father in 1766 when he was 11 years old. In 1772, the British Admiralty made a spontaneous offer to Georg's father, the scientist Reinhold Forster, to join the upcoming second voyage of James Cook to the South Seas, to compile a scientific report about the journey and to publish it upon their return. The father agreed on the condition that his 17-year-old son Georg would accompany them as a draftsman and scientific assistant. After more than 3 years, they returned from this journey. At the age of 23, Georg published the English version of a travel narrative in London under the captivating title A Voyage Round the World. The travel report became one of the most fascinating books of its time. Not only did it mark the beginning of modern travel literature, but it also stood out in both content and style from other accounts of Cook's groundbreaking explorations, offering a captivating diversity of the unusual. His book had a strong influence on many later ethnologists. Forster's narratives and reflections are always focused on the foundations of humanity, with a particular emphasis on the fascinating social behavior of individuals and groups of people. Let us dive into the depth of this literary adventure, sailing not only around the world but also exploring the essence of humanity. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern English. Forster's knowledge is that of the second half of the 18th century, so in the Voyage to Go History podcast, I will occasionally provide additional information and assistance. What happened in the last episode?
In the last episode of the voyage, the crew of the Resolution witnesses an elaborate courtly dance on Raiatea. The performance is led by Poyadua, the daughter of District Chief Orea, and the graceful Tainamai, one of the most admired dancers on the island. The next day, a celebrated island beauty receives a harsh lesson in greed and vanity when a padlock she begged for is clipped to her ear. Though not physically harmed, the act serves as a warning, and afterwards the women's begging ceases. Tensions rise when Orea, the influential chief of the district, flees in panic, mistakenly believing he might be taken as a hostage. Trust is later restored through gifts and kind gestures. Meanwhile, Orea, a noble young islander and former traveling companion of the crew, mysteriously vanishes, leaving the crew puzzled and concerned. His disappearance casts a shadow over the group, but in a surprising turn, the spirited Hedidi, a bold and curious youth eager for adventure, steps forward and volunteers to sail to Europe. Boats from the nearby island of Taha bring supplies and stories, enriching the traveler's understanding of the region's nature and customs. At the Bay of Maheine, they witness a funeral lament and a hiva dance, where even young children perform. As they reach the island's main village, a theft occurs. A bag containing valuable trade goods disappears, allegedly taken by one of the locals. To recover what was stolen, the sailors confiscate animals and property, using threats until a stolen bag is returned, ending their stay on uneasy terms.
Friday, September 17th, 1773, Raiatea, Society Islands.
The next morning, the owners of the confiscated goods were told that everything would be returned, if they brought back the stolen glass beads and nails. While the villagers prepared to fulfill this condition, the crew set out toward Orea, a bay on the southwestern side of the island. They had not gone far when Ta and the other chief, the one with the swollen leg, who could walk just as well as anyone else, arrived with most of the missing iron goods. They explained that the items had been hidden here and there in the bushes. After this, the sailors returned the cloth, the pigs, the breastplates, and everything else they had taken. They also rewarded the man whose hut had sheltered them that night, as well as the old chief, since both had shown great loyalty and willingness to help. With the recovered glass beads, the crew was able to buy a new load of bananas in the district of Hervey and in the Bay of Apoto, also called the Round Bay. There they found a house far larger than any they had seen in the other Society Islands. It was full of people, and several families lived together inside. It seemed to be a public building, much like a caravanserai in the Levant, meant for travelers. After trading away the rest of their nails and glass beads and eating lunch, the group returned to the ships. They arrived around 4 p.m., soaked to the bone by the waves that had splashed into the boats on the way back. The next morning, Orea arrived with his family and many others to say farewell. Most of this visit was meant for their new fellow traveler, Hedidi, who had come aboard the day before. All his friends and relatives now gathered around him, bringing loads of cloth and a good supply of fermented breadfruit paste for the journey. This paste was one of the best food sources. On this occasion, Orea's daughter, who had never dared visit the ship before, also came aboard. She hoped the captain would give her the green awning from the boat, which must have greatly pleased her. She received many gifts, but her main wish the captain could not grant. In the end, the islanders were eager to trade and sold much of their tools, household items, and other belongings. When they finally set sail, the kind people left them with great sadness. Their tears seemed to reproach the crew for being unmoved. Indeed, such feelings had been too strongly suppressed by the way they had been raised. They had been told too often to feel ashamed of emotions, and so those feelings had sadly faded. On these islands, by contrast, the unspoiled children of nature gave free rein to everything they felt, and rejoiced in their affection for others. By 10 a.m., they had safely passed the reef of Maheine and now steered west-southwest, keeping the islands of Raiatea, Taha, and Borabora still in sight. Although it had been only a month since their arrival at Tahiti, they had fully recovered from the effects of that long and exhausting voyage spent during the worst season in cold and wet weather. Even those who had suffered most from scurvy were now as healthy as the rest. The fresh herbs and fruits from the Society Islands had likely played the biggest part in this quick recovery. For already when they departed from their first refreshment spot, Atepiaha, the sick had clearly improved, even though they hadn't tasted any fresh meat there. So they could now confidently expect continued good health for the coming month, as they were well supplied with fresh provisions. Each ship carried between 200 and 300 pigs, a large number of chickens, a few dogs, and a generous stock of bananas. These bananas were stored on the ship's stern, scattered like in a fruit garden. True, the lack of space caused some pigs to die, and the older pigs, stubborn in their refusal to eat the unfamiliar food, cost them quite a few more. But soon they found a good way to avoid this issue. They slaughtered and salted all the pigs that couldn't handle the tight quarters. This way the meat stayed edible and juicy. At least it tasted far better, and was healthier than the salted pork they had brought from England, which was now so soaked in salt that soaking it in water also washed away all its strength and flavor. The only discomfort they experienced from their stay on these islands was that many sailors had to suffer the consequences of close contact with promiscuous women. Yet the diseases they caught were mild and could be cured with simple remedies, and didn't keep anyone from doing their duty. Their young friend Hedidi, whom they had taken along instead of the Tahitian Orea, was extremely seasick, as he wasn't used to the motion of the ship. But while they looked out toward the high peak of Borabora, he told them he had been born on that island, and was related to Opuni, the warlike king who had conquered Taha and Raiatea. He also revealed that his real name was Maheine, but that he had exchanged names with a chief on Eumeo, who went by Hedidi. This custom, as Georg had already noted, was common on all these islands. According to their companion, King Puni was currently on the island of Maurua, which they passed in the afternoon. It consisted of a single cone-shaped mountain, and as far as they could gather from the descriptions given by inhabitants of Raiatea, who had been there themselves, it had roughly the same features as the other islands. Their poor friend didn't regain his appetite until the following afternoon. Then, to start with, he enjoyed a piece of a 28-pound dorado caught by one of the crew. They wanted to prepare it in their usual way, but he insisted it tasted better raw and only asked for a bowl of seawater to dip the fish in. Between bites, he alternated with a chunk of maheine, or sour breadfruit paste, which served him as a kind of bread. Before he sat down to eat, he took a small piece of the fish and some maheine as an offering to Eua, the divine being, and said a few words which they assumed were a short prayer. He followed the same ritual a couple of days later when he ate a raw piece of shark. All of this convinced the crew that his people held certain religious beliefs and practiced a kind of ceremonial worship, possibly a tradition preserved since their ancestors first separated from the mainland. Until the 23rd, they continued their course without anything remarkable occurring. But on that day, at sunrise, they spotted a low island lying to the left of the ship. They steered toward it, and by noon saw that it consisted of two parts. According to their observations, their southern latitude was then 19 degrees 8 minutes. The land was covered in thick bushes and leafy trees, above which the tall tops of coconut palms rose in large numbers. With the help of telescopes, they noticed that the coast was sandy, though in places overgrown with green, likely the common creeping vine Convolvulus brasiliensis found in this region. Both islands, or land masses, appeared connected by a rocky reef. Though pleasant in appearance, they seemed entirely uninhabited. Captain Cook named the island Hervey Island, in honor of the now Earl of Bristol. The day before, a bird resembling a sandpiper in flight and song had appeared near the ship and might have been a sign of this island. But as Georg had noted before, such signs were often misleading. For example, 3 days later, they again saw a bird that even perched in the rigging. Yet they encountered no land. From Hervey Island, located at 19 degree 18 south latitude and 158 degree 54 west longitude from Greenwich, they continued westward until October 1st. At 2 p.m. that day, the cry "land" was heard. It lay directly ahead and seemed fairly high. In 4 hours, they were no more than 4 to 6 kilometers, 2 to 3 nautical miles from shore. The mountains were wooded, and though not spectacular, offered a pleasing sight. At the southwestern end, they noticed a small rocky island. To the north, a stretch of low-lying land extended further. The landscape and all circumstances convinced them that the island ahead was the same one named Middelburg by Abel Janszoon Tasman in 1643, and that the northern one was Amsterdam Island, also discovered by him. As night fell, they hove to and waited for daylight. At dawn, they sailed around the southwestern tip of Middelburg and then along its western coast. At the foot of the mountains, there appeared to be flat land with young banana plants. Their bright green leaves contrasted beautifully with the varied colors of the bushes and the brown coconut palms. The daylight was still faint, so they could see the hut fires of the locals flickering through the trees in several places. Soon after, some people appeared on the shore. The mountains were low and barely rose higher than the Isle of Wight from the sea. Here and there, groups of trees were scattered gracefully, and between them, the ground was covered with grass, much like in England. Several islanders pushed their canoes into the water and paddled toward the ship. One canoe came fairly close, and they threw it a rope. One of the men caught it immediately, pulled the canoe alongside, and came on board. Upon boarding, he presented them with a pepper root, as had been seen in the Society Islands, touched their noses with his, just as the New Zealanders did to show friendship, and then sat silently on deck. The captain gave him a nail, which he immediately held above his head while shouting the word "Whagafatai," likely an expression of thanks. He was naked except for a piece of brown-dyed cloth wrapped from his waist to his knees. This fabric seemed similar in type and workmanship to Tahitian cloth, but had been stiffened and waterproofed with glue or varnish. The man was of medium build and had gentle, fairly regular facial features. His skin tone was like that of ordinary Tahitians, light mahogany brown. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his black hair hung around his head in short curls, as tightly coiled as if it had been singed. Each of his arms had 3 round marks, each about the size of a silver coin, raised on the skin like embossed dots in the Tahitian style, though not darkened with pigment. They formed a pattern of concentric circles, the outer ones being the largest, and the inner ones progressively smaller. In addition, he had other black markings on his body. His earlobes had 2 holes, each holding a small round stick, and the little finger of his left hand was missing. He sat silently for quite a while. However, several others who boarded after him were much more talkative and spoke to the crew in their own language, which the Europeans couldn't understand at all. Meanwhile, they had reached the northwestern tip of the island and dropped anchor there at 9 a.m. Hardly had this happened when a crowd of canoes pushed off from the land toward them. Each canoe held 3 to 4 men, offering large amounts of their goods for trade. The canoes were small, about 5 meters long, very narrow, and covered at both ends. Like the Tahitian boats, they usually had poles as outriggers, but to Georg they seemed much better and more cleanly made. They were joined and smoothed with astonishing precision. The paddles, like those in Tahiti, had short, broad blades, but were also more finely crafted and made from better wood. The islanders made a great noise around them, as each showed what he had for sale, and shouted at every one of the crew who appeared on deck. The language sounded pleasant and was spoken in a singing tone. Some of them were bold enough to come aboard, including one man who seemed to be a chief or person of rank. He received all kinds of gifts. Each time he was given something, he raised it above his head and said "Whagawhetai." He admired their English cloth and linen most, but liked their iron goods even more. He showed no concern or shyness and went below deck or wherever else they wanted to take him without hesitation. From him, they learned that the island where they had anchored, called Middleburg by Tasman, was known in the local language as Eua. The other island to the north, Tasman's Amsterdam, was called Tonga-Tabu. To be certain, they asked other locals as well, and everywhere received the same answer. After breakfast, they went ashore, accompanied by the captain and the nobleman. In this area, the coast was lined with a coral reef that ran parallel to the shore, with only a few gaps through which canoes and small boats could pass. Both the people in the boats and those on the beach greeted them with loud shouts of joy. The canoes came close to their boat, and the people threw large bundles of cloth aboard without asking for anything in return. Others, men and women alike, swam around them, holding up small items for sale, such as rings made of turtle shell, fishing hooks of mother of pearl, and similar things. Once they had passed through the crowd of canoes and reached the shore as close as the shallow water allowed, the locals eagerly offered to carry them on their shoulders to dry land. Having thus reached the coast, the islanders gathered around and showed them hospitality with every sign of friendship. They offered fruit, weapons, and household items as gifts. The welcome could not have been warmer, even if the people had already known European ships. But that was not the case. Most likely, they had never seen Europeans before and knew of Tasman's visit to the neighboring island Amsterdam, called Tonga, only through stories. Given these circumstances, they had to consider the islanders open-hearted and well-meaning people, entirely free of suspicion. This impression was further strengthened by the presence of many women, something rare among other indigenous peoples, where women were often kept away from strangers. These women were dressed from the waist to the feet and greeted the newcomers with kind and welcoming smiles, as if inviting them to come closer. Georg observed that Mr. Hodges had created a beautiful painting of this remarkable and friendly welcome, which was later engraved for Captain Cook's travel account. Although Georg appreciated the work of this talented artist, he noted that the depiction of the islanders of Eua and Tonga-Tabu was not accurate. The engraving showed Greek contours and figures that had never existed in the South Seas. The image of an old dignified man with a long white beard was excellent, But the men of Eua did not grow beards. They kept them trimmed short.
The ship's artist, William Hodges, who accompanied James Cook on his second voyage to the Pacific, often portrayed the people of the South Seas with features and poses reminiscent of ancient Greek sculpture. This stylistic choice was not accidental, but reflected the artistic ideals and cultural mindset of 18th century Europe, particularly the influence of neoclassicism. At the time, classical antiquity, especially ancient Greece, was seen as the highest standard of beauty, virtue, and human form. Artists and intellectuals believed that Greek art embodied a universal ideal of harmony, proportion, and nobility. By portraying Polynesians with idealized bodies, noble expressions, and heroic postures, Hodges was not simply documenting what he saw, but elevating his subjects to fit the aesthetic and philosophical ideals of his time. This approach also supported Enlightenment ideas about the noble savage, the belief that non-European peoples lived in a more natural, virtuous state, uncorrupted by modern civilization. By giving Polynesians the visual dignity of Greek heroes, Hodges helped reinforce the notion that these societies were not primitive but had their own kind of moral and aesthetic nobility. In this way, Hodges' artistic choices reflected both admiration and projection. Admiration for the people he encountered, and projection of European ideals onto unfamiliar cultures.
They didn't linger long on the coast, but followed the leader, who invited them to move further inland. From the shore, the ground rose steeply for a few steps, then leveled into a beautiful meadow, surrounded by tall trees and dense bushes, so that there was only a clear view toward the sea. At the far end of this meadow, about 45 meters from the landing place, stood a very pretty house with a roof reaching down to within 60 centimeters of the ground. The path to it led across the green field, which was so smooth and grassy that it reminded them of the finest lawns in England. When they arrived at the house, they were invited to rest inside. The floor was covered with the finest mats, and in one corner they saw a movable partition made of woven material. Judging by the gestures of the islanders, this was where the sleeping area lay. The roof was made of rafters and rounded wooden beams, carefully joined together and covered with a mat of banana leaves. They had hardly sat down in the house, surrounded by more than 100 people, when 2 or 3 women began to greet them with a song. Though the melody was simple, it sounded pleasant and far more musical than the songs of the Tahitians. The singers had very melodious voices and harmonized with one another. At the same time, they kept rhythm by snapping their thumbs and index fingers while holding the other 3 fingers of each hand upright. After the first 3 finished, 3 more began the same melody, and in the end, it became a full chorus. One of the gentlemen traveling with them wrote down one of the songs for Georg, and thanks to that, it has been preserved to this day. The melody extended no further than 4 tones. They never sang lower than A and never higher than E. They sang very slowly and sometimes ended with a chord. The warmth of the people showed in every gesture and action. They did their best to serve Georg and his companions with coconuts, whose milk was extremely tasty. Everything contributed to making their stay pleasant. Even the air they breathed was filled with balsamic scents. At first, they didn't know where this wonderful smell came from. Upon closer inspection, they discovered it came from a kind of lemon tree blooming behind the house. Soon the islanders also brought them fruits from these trees. In the West Indies, such fruits are known as shaddocks. In Batavia and the East Indian Islands, they are called pomelos. These were perfectly round, almost the size of a child's head, and had an excellent taste. On both sides of the meadow in front of the house ran a fence made of reed rods, woven crosswise and tightly bound together. Through this fence they passed through a wooden gate that hung on ropes and closed behind them by itself, entering a neatly laid-out orchard. The reed fence was overgrown with morning glories, most of them blooming in sky blue. To explore the locals' garden more closely, they split into different groups and found new reasons for satisfaction with every step. The land looked everywhere like an expansive garden, crossed by tall coconut palms, banana trees, and shady lemon and breadfruit trees. In these graceful surroundings, they wandered and discovered many new plants not found on the Society Islands, including Tahiti. A footpath eventually led them to a dwelling similar to the one on the meadow, surrounded by bushes whose blossoms filled the air with fragrance. The inhabitants seemed more industrious and energetic than the Tahitians. They let Georg walk around freely and only accompanied him when asked to. In such cases, they could rely on the safety of their pockets, as long as they weren't carrying nails, which the locals liked to take. One by one, they passed through more than 10 such plantations or gardens, all fenced individually and connected by gates. Almost every garden had a house, though the residents were usually not present. The enclosed layout of their lands pointed to a higher level of cultivation than they had expected. The people were more advanced and refined in both handicrafts and music than the inhabitants of the Society Islands, where the Tahitians were wealthier but also more sluggish. Here they saw only a few chickens and pigs, and the breadfruit trees, which provided abundant and excellent food on the Society Islands, were rare. For that reason, the locals lived mainly on roots and bananas. In terms of clothing, they were also less wealthy than the Tahitians, who were more extravagant in this respect. Their homes were beautifully built and always set among fragrant bushes, but they were neither as spacious nor as comfortable as those in Tahiti. With these observations in mind, they returned to the landing place where many hundreds of locals had gathered. Their appearance showed that, even though their land was not as rich in natural goods as Tahiti, those goods seemed more evenly distributed among the people. In Tahiti, the nobility could be recognized by their lighter skin and well-shaped bodies. Here, however, all outward distinctions had disappeared. The leader who had come aboard and then accompanied them ashore did not differ in clothing from the common people. Only the obedience shown to his commands made it clear he must have been of higher rank. They mingled with the gathered crowd and were warmly welcomed by young and old, men and women alike. The locals embraced them, sometimes kissed their hands, and pressed them to their chests. The men were of average height, between 1.6 and 1.8 meters, 5 feet 3 inches to 5 feet 11 inches, with extremely well-proportioned and handsome bodies, though somewhat more muscular than the Tahitians. This was likely due to the greater and more constant physical effort required by their way of farming and housekeeping. Their facial features were gentle and very pleasant, but longer than those of the Tahitians. The nose was especially sharper and the lips thinner. They had beautiful black eyes that still sparkled with vitality even in older individuals. Their teeth were healthy, white, and well-aligned. Their hair, mostly black and tightly curled, was worn short by both men and women, and partly combed upward so that it stood stiff like bristles. The children's hair was cut even shorter, leaving just a tuft at the crown and one above each ear. The beards were trimmed short, or rather pinched off close to the skin, using sharp-shell tools. The women were generally a few centimeters shorter than the men, though not as small as the common women on Tahiti and the Society Islands. Their upper bodies were always beautifully proportioned, and their hands and arms were as delicately shaped as those of the Tahitian women. However, like them, they had feet that were too large and legs that were too thick. Their facial features were not necessarily regular in beauty, but they had a very pleasant expression, something commonly found among the women of the Society Islands. However, on those islands, especially among the nobility, there were individual beauties that they didn't find here. Both men and women, regardless of status, had a light chestnut-brown skin tone and seemed to be in excellent health overall. Among the men, tattooing and darkening of the skin was widespread. Especially the abdomen and loins were heavily tattooed, and in patterns even more elaborate than those they had seen on Tahiti. Even the most delicate parts of the body, where the procedure had to be not only painful but also dangerous due to the sensitivity of the area, were tattooed. Georg and his companions were rightly astonished by this.
That concludes episode 30 of Georg Forster's journey around the world about the HMS Resolution with Captain Cook. You'll find a map of this episode's key locations in the show notes. To see how these places look today, visit my YouTube channel Voyage to Go, where I follow Forster's footsteps and uncover connections between past and present. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episode of this extraordinary voyage. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.